It's 10 years since I last spoke and gave a public lecture at Dalhousie, and it's one of my very fond memories, so I've looked forward to this occasion. Then I talked about history of residential schools. This afternoon I'd like to talk about the history of treaty making in Canada over the last 4 centuries, emphasizing in particular the contribution of the Maritime region to that lengthy and complicated story. About 4 centuries ago, at a site called Port Royal, or Port Royal, a new relationship was formed by the Mi'kmaq chief Membertoon, the Sieur de Poutrincourt, the leader of a French expedition. Just a few years earlier, a similar event, and this is a picture of Membertoon, a similar event occurred at the mouth of the Saguenay, where the Saguenay joins the St. Lawrence. And then it was Inuit chief Anadabiju who conducted similar ceremonies to establish a relationship with the French commander of that expedition. The similarity is not accidental. There's a reason for it, because there's something important going on in these initial encounters and the rituals through which the different parties, Indigenous and newcomer, go. In both cases, what is going on is that Europeans and First Nations are establishing relationships through the use of Indigenous ceremonies. An obvious question is, well, why? Why was that necessary? And the answer to that lies in the nature and dynamics of Indigenous societies, because in those societies it was simply unthinkable to enter into relations, whether commercial or diplomatic or relationships of alliance, relationships of any kind, with someone you did not know. To do so was dangerous. It had to be assumed that anyone with whom you were not related and had a friendly relationship was potentially an enemy and a danger. So it was because Indigenous people needed to create relationships with strangers that these ceremonies occurred. How did they occur? They occurred through ceremony, through ritual. And again, it's Indigenous ceremony that gets used. And we see it very, very clearly and very early in the first form of interaction, the commercial relationship, the fur trade in particular, between native and newcomer, essentially. And there, these ceremonies are used to create and renew a relationship that will permit an ongoing partnership for the extraction of fur by the Europeans. What do we mean by ceremony? Well, again, we see it very clearly in the fur trade relationship. There were various ceremonies, all of them typical of Indigenous societies, indeed across the country. Things such as the welcome. This is from the later Hudson Bay Company trading in the West, but the same things or versions of them happened everywhere. There would be a formal welcome. The approaching party would fire their muskets. They'd be answered by the friendly volley from the cannon at the trading post. They would be met by the post commandant. There would be brief welcomes exchanged. And then they would proceed inside, where more ritual, more ceremony went on. Again, speeches, gift-giving, inquiries after each other's health since the last time they met. And above all in importance, the smoking of the pipe, as you can see very clearly here. It is through ceremonies like that that First Nations and consequently soon Europeans created and renewed relationships. And a First Nations trade leader who was satisfied with the treatment they'd been accorded at the trading post would leave the pipe behind in the keeping of the post commander, signifying that all was well in the relationship, and they would be back next year or as soon as they could manage. Conversely, if things had not gone well, the leader of the visiting party to the post would take the pipe away, meaning thereby the relationship was at an end. It's because these are solemn ceremonies, that they're highly ritualized, and above all, because the Europeans who enter into them with First Nations, whether at the mouth of the Saguenay or at Port Royal or later in the Hudson Bay Company lands, the Europeans who are doing these things are representatives of the Crown, monopoly trading companies, and later Crown colony governors. These are the reasons that my argument is that these are not just commercial agreements, these are commercial treaties, because they involve the crown, because they are solemn, because they are highly ritualized. And this form of treaty making, what I call commercial compact, was the first form of treaty making. It had to be because you could not conduct relations otherwise. But very soon, alongside commercial compacts, emerged a second type of treaty, the Treaty of Alliance, the Treaty of Peace and Friendship. In fact, to put it that way, that there are two different things, commercial compacts and treaties of peace and friendship, is to use very Eurocentric language. Because to indigenous peoples in North America, these were not separate things. These were merely two sides of the same coin. As a Haudenosaunee or Iroquois leader put it to the governor of New York in 1735, "Trade and peace we take to be one thing," he said. "You don't get one without the other." There are two sides of the same coin to First Nations. That coin is the coin of kinship, created and renewed by ceremony, basically. Also, in the peace and friendship era, an important example of the First Nations approach to making these treaties was that they kept their own records, of course. The wampum belt, which you find in this region, as you do in the northeastern woodlands as well. And this form of treaty, the Peace and Friendship Treaty, occupies a long and distinguished history in the early relationship between native and newcomer in the eastern half of North America. If you look closely at these slides, you may notice that the wampum in the second slide is in fact the same belt. And what's happening in the second belt is that the First Nations leader is telling the wampum, he's reciting what the symbolism of the shells and the figures mean. It's their archives. It's First Nations archives. And these are the record of the negotiation and the achievement of a treaty of alliance, of peace and friendship. This is a multifaceted phase of treaty making. It occurs with French and with English and in various parts of the eastern half of North America. The French version of it probably culminates, in the Great Peace of Montreal of 1701. That peace involved some 36 or 37 First Nations representing peoples stretching from the Atlantic well into the center of the continent, as far perhaps as Dakota territories, for example. And what it did, it ended 6 decades of on and off warfare between the Iroquois, in particular, or the Haudenosaunee, and the French crown. And moreover, it embraced all the allies of both the Haudenosaunee and the other native groups involved, the French allies. And so it was a mammoth, a complex, an amazing accomplishment. It was, amongst the French, the apogee, the height of the peace and friendship treaty making phase, the second phase. But it's not, pardon me, I've got going the wrong way, sorry. But it's not just the French that do this, and it's not just on the banks of the St. Lawrence. The British experience is very, very similar. And in the interior in particular, officials like William Johnson, this gentleman, were key figures in that process. Johnson, later Sir William Johnson, may look like a court dandy in this picture, but he was in fact one of the most cunning and accomplished forest diplomats we've ever had in the history of North America. He was involved in close trade relations with the Mohawk in particular, from his home in the Mohawk Valley. He was married to a Mohawk clan matron, Molly Brant, and through her had close links to the Mohawk and the other nations of the Haudenosaunee. And Johnson was in fact one of the first minister of Indian Affairs, if you like, because he headed the northern portion of the Indian Department when it was created in 1755. So Johnson is a very good example of how the British also took to the use of indigenous ceremony and practice, the pipe, the speech, the gift, to create and to renew the ties now for peace and friendship purposes that you also found amongst they and the French. And of course in Acadia, this part of the country, there was also a very rich history of peace and friendship treaties as well. Acadia, or as the British called it after 1713 in the Treaty of Utrecht in Nova Scotia, there is also a rich history by the British making treaties with the indigenous population, mainly the Mi'kmaq, Passamaquoddy, Abenaki, and Penobscot. There's a very striking contrast, though, between the French regime in the region, which remember began in 1610 in terms of relations with the Mi'kmaq in particular, and the British experience. Between 1610 and 1760, when the French were defeated at Montreal, France made a grand total of 1 formal treaty with First Nations in this region. In contrast, between 1720 and 1786, Great Britain made 32 treaties of peace and friendship with First Nations. What's going on here? Why the contrast? Well, part of the contrast is that the French relied on that informal use of ritual and ceremony to establish the relationships, to renew them, and to keep them healthy. The British were trying to move into Nova Scotia and replace the French in the relationship with First Nations. And they were constantly fighting an uphill battle to establish the kind of relationship the French had had. And they made a lot of treaties because they kept falling apart, basically. That's really what was going on. But though the French presence here was so well established since the creation of the habitation at Port-Royal, that the British had a hard time replacing the French in that relationship. But though it was an uphill struggle for the British, they did accomplish some very important treaty making in this region. One of the early major examples is the 1726 treaty, sometimes called Mascarene's Treaty, which was in fact the northern extension or duplication of the Treaty of Boston of 1725, a treaty that had ended the Abenaki War, or one of the Abenaki Wars. It was extremely important. It had a lengthy and complex history. The Treaty of 1726 was renewed in 1749, and then again with some Mi'kmaq groups in particular, another version was negotiated in 1752. After the creation of Halifax and the creation of Lunenburg in 1753 caused real disruptions in the relations the British were trying to build with the Mi'kmaq. 1752 treaty, though it's narrow and applies to very few groups, is interesting because of the explicit guarantees it contains about recognizing continuing hunting, fishing, and gathering rights on the part of the Mi'kmaq in particular. And then the final example from this creative phase of peace and friendship treaty making. Sorry, I keep missing a slide. Was 1760-61. The 7 Years' War between Britain and France and its colonial extensions ended in this region in 1758 with the fall of Louisbourg, and Britain moved to restore friendly relations with the First Nations, especially with the Mi'kmaq of this region. And in 1760 and 61, a number of peace and friendship treaties were signed to restore peace. That arc of treaty making from 1726 through 1761 and beyond, in fact, into the 1780s, is a period of creative, rich treaty making and relationship building, and sometimes relationship collapse in this region. And it's one of the reasons that this maritime region is such an important part of the peace and friendship phase, the second phase of the treaty making history. Another consequence of the end of the 7 Years' War was the Royal Proclamation of 1763. The Royal Proclamation was the document, a unilateral Crown document issued in October 1763 over the signature of George III, by which Britain attempted to regularize and set up institutions for its new possessions it had acquired as a result of the defeat of France and the Peace of Paris in 1763. Quebec, East Florida, West Florida, Grenada were the principal colonies it had to integrate into its empire. So though most of the proclamation deals with issues involving those colonies, there are 7 potent clauses at the end of it that deal specifically with First Nations and First Nation rights, basically. The language is complex, but it does 2 things in particular of great, well, 3 things in particular of great moment. It creates a western boundary beyond which settlement is not supposed to move, so there will not be incursions into First Nations territory west of the Appalachian Mountains. It provides a kind of recognition of territorial right on the part of the First Nations because it says that lands beyond the western boundary of Quebec and beyond the Appalachian height of land are, quote, lands reserved to them as their hunting grounds, end quote. The British Crown recognizing some kind of territorial possessory right on the part of the First Nations. And then it goes on, and this is where we get back to the treaty-making story. It goes on to say, but if First Nations, Indian nations it said, were willing to wish to surrender some of that land to non-natives, they may do so, quote, only to us at a public meeting called for the purpose. And every one of those words is extremely important. Only to us means only to the Crown. There cannot be private land deals. You can only deal with lands of First Nations via the Crown. And it can only take place at a public meeting. No backroom or, more dangerously, tavern deals where you get a deed signed by some unrepresentative person from a First Nation and then try to enforce it. And the meeting must be called for the purpose so the community has to know this is what's going on. Surrendered only to the Crown at a public meeting called for the purpose. And that is the essence of treaty making in the 3rd and lengthiest period of treaty making history in this country. This is the formula or the protocol or the mechanism for the making of territorial treaties. Because the Royal Proclamation is paving the way, is ushering in a period of massive European immigration and settlement in the northeastern part of North America. You can see it already occurred. I referred to this. This is the reenactment of the 1753 creation of Lunenburg. This is just a leading edge of the kind of wave of settlement that will occur. First Nations will be, particularly in this region, subjected to a series of encroachments as squatters settle on their lands in the late 18th and first half of the 19th century. And they're gradually dispossessed and pushed to the margins of Maritime, Nova Scotia, and New Brunswick, and PEI societies. How could that happen? There was a Royal Proclamation. The Royal Proclamation did not apply in Nova Scotia. And that is really how it could happen. Where the Royal Proclamation did apply, the process of dispossession still happened. But it happened usually according to the formula laid down by the Royal Proclamation, because the place that the Royal Proclamation gets applied and the procedures worked out in great detail is what becomes Southern Ontario, Upper Canada or Canada West, before Confederation in 1867. It takes place in 3 phases. The first territorial treaty made following the Royal Proclamation is a treaty with the Seneca around the Niagara River in 1764. But then a more creative phase begins in the 1784 north of the lakes and beginning in this region. And what will happen between 1784 and 1812, in the War of 1812, is that a series of treaties will be made with the Mississauga, the local Anishinaabe First Nations, along what they called the front, the river and the lake. Why there? Because the river and the lakes were the highway. There were no roads, basically, and that's what settlers used. So that's the first phase. When the Crown negotiated, usually publicly, usually openly, at meetings called for the purpose, using Aboriginal protocol again, gift-giving, speech-making, all that stuff, for access to land for settlers, for loyalists in 1784, and then for settlers later on. The payment or compensation in those territorial treaties from 1784 to 1812 was a one-time upfront payment. Another phase comes after the War of 1812, when Britain first has to locate former allies in the war against the Americans, the War of 1812, and then, fairly soon thereafter, has to provide peaceful access to land for a tidal wave of British immigration that begins to roll across British North America in the 1820s, down to the 1850s. There's one important change, two changes. The second wave of treaty making takes place in a series of tracks behind the front, basically like this. The other big change that occurs is that in the second phase of territorial treaty making in Upper Canada, they shift from one-time payments to annuities, smaller annual payments, which First Nations welcome, partly because it's an ongoing source of financial support, but it's also the symbolic renewal of the relationship, and it's very important to them for that reason. And then there's a third phase in Upper Canada before Confederation of territorial treaty making, and this is the making of the Robinson Treaties in 1850. Robinson Huron, and though you can't see it on the map, Robinson Superior. Two treaties, large territories, made in 1850 by the Crown. Robinson completes the evolution of territorial treaty making before Confederation. It begins now to deal with large tracts of land. It has explicit recognition and promises about continuing hunting-gathering rights on the part of First Nations, and it has explicit provision for the creation of reserves. Whether you noticed it or not, I have not mentioned reserves till now. Reserves were not part of treaty until Robinson Treaties of 1850s. But from this point on, treaty making and reserve creation are become almost always inseparable. So what we have by Confederation, I should add that Robinson Treaty is actually continued in 1862 in the Manitoulin Island Treaty as well. What we have by Confederation then is a very full development of territorial treaties that are embodied most effectively in the Robinson Treaties. That was important, that kind of pattern had been laid down and established, well ingrained. Because, of course, one of the first projects that the new Dominion of Canada is going to pursue after July 1867 is the integration, the acquisition and integration of the West, the Hudson's Bay Company lands, Rupert's Land, which happened to be occupied by tens of thousands of very viable First Nations communities. And it's also occupied by some 12,000 Métis around Red River, basically. So how is the new Dominion going to deal with these people? Well, it didn't start very well. It ignored the Métis in acquiring Rupert's Land in a deal in 1869, 1870, and for its pains, Canada got the Red River Resistance, which very much frightened the government of Canada. So when it turned to dealing with First Nations, who were more numerous and a bigger military threat in the West after 1870, it reverted to that Upper Canadian pattern of treaty making. Between 1871 and 1877, a series of 7 territorial treaties was made. Treaties which stretched from Treaty 3 in northwestern Ontario all the way to Treaty 7 in southern Alberta. So that you go from the northwest angle, Lake of the Woods, to the foothills of the Rockies, from the international boundary, the 49th parallel, to a point roughly halfway up the 3 prairie provinces. An empire, a huge territory. And just for future reference, notice this little agreement, which is the Montreal Lake Adhesion. Canada has learned its lesson from Red River. The men who are in charge of Canadian policy, including John A. Macdonald, whose image I showed, the first Prime Minister, and incidentally the longest serving Minister of Indian Affairs Canada has ever had. He was Minister of Indian Affairs from 1878 to 1887. The people in charge had learned how you dealt with First Nations in the old pre-Confederation setting. They were the ones deciding on policy. They were the ones who proceeded to implement basically versions of the Robinson Treaties in Western Canada. Now, the Western treaties, like the Peace and Friendship Treaties and the Maritimes, are very important legally and politically right down to the present day. And one of the reasons they're so important is there has from the beginning been a fundamental disagreement between Indigenous people and the government of non-Native people as to the nature of those treaties. Canada takes a very narrow legalistic approach right from the beginning, indeed before the beginning, because in 1876, when Treaty 6 was being made in August, September, Canada had already passed and had approved by the Governor General the Indian Act in April 1876. Canada is now saying, no, no, these are just contracts for land. You give up the land, we pay you. We pay you annuities, we create schools. Well, actually, you said you create schools on reserve, and you didn't. You sent the kids to residential school, but that's a whole other story. You know, you provide agricultural equipment, instruction, seed, money, ammunition, twine, so forth. So that's the deal as far as Canada. These are just contracts. Bang, that's all she wrote. And if we relate to you under the terms of the Indian Act instead of what you say are the terms of the treaty, well, tough. That's just the way it is, because the bison are all gone and you've been weakened dramatically and we're not afraid of you anymore. That's a very crude, really lampoon of what happens, but that is what happens between about 1876 and the early 1880s. Well, that's not how Western First Nations understood what they'd agreed to in those 7 treaties between 1871 and 1877. These were not contracts for land. These were covenants to create a relationship between peoples by which they would agree to live together amicably and support each other. First Nations say it's a covenant. What's a covenant? Well, a covenant's not a contract. If you've ever been to a Christian wedding ceremony, you've attended a creation of a covenant. A covenant is agreement between 2 or more parties and the deity, basically. And First Nations in the West say, well, what was all that pipe smoking that went on at all those treaties, except for Treaty 4 where they didn't do it? What was all that about if it wasn't about bringing the deity into the process? And what were all that rhetoric on both sides about the Great Spirit overseeing what was happening and, you know, doing this in the sight of God, as your people said, if it wasn't about creating a covenant? Canada said, no, it's just a contract. And they just essentially had the power, and they proceeded to ignore First Nations protests about it. So the reason that the Territorial Treaties of the West, which cover such an enormous area now, such a wealth-producing area, of course, had been so troubled is because from the beginning there's been this fundamental difference in how the treaty is perceived and how the parties relate to them. With Canada saying, no, they're just contracts, we have the land, you got paid, you're being paid your $5 every June, that's all there is to it. And the First Nations saying, no, 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 there's a spirit and intent behind this. It's about creating a relationship, and it's about renewing it through things like annuities. That's what this is about, and it was done involving the Creator as well. After 1877, Canada takes a very narrow and legalistic approach to its obligations, and in response for over 20 years to entreaties by a variety of other First Nations in the other parts of the West and the Northwest, requests, petitions for entering treaty with a stony silence or a flat refusal. The exception is that one area I pointed out, the Montreal Lake Adhesion in 1889. But throughout the West and the Northwest, after 1877, other First Nations wanted to enter treaty, and Canada said, no, we're not interested. We have all the land we can handle. It's not being settled as rapidly as we would like by agricultural settlers. We don't need more land. We're not interested, basically. And then things changed. Between 1899 and 1921, Canada made another 4 extremely important treaties in the north. Treaty 8, basically northwestern Saskatchewan, northern Alberta, in the northeast corner of BC, stretching up towards but not reaching Yukon. Treaty 9, this is an image from Treaty 9 negotiations, northern Ontario. Treaty 10, northern Saskatchewan, northern Manitoba. And Treaty 11, southern part of the Northwest Territories. What's going on? What's the change? A desire on the part of government and Southerners for access to resources that First Nations control. In the 1870s, there had been peaceful access to agricultural lands for immigrants to settle on. Now it's access to resource, usually mineral-rich lands. Treaty 8 is negotiated to provide for peaceful overland access to Yukon, where gold is discovered in 1896-97, the Klondike Gold Rush. Treaty 9, Northern Ontario, which is well known it's made in 1905, 1906, it's well known, is resource-rich, base metals and gold and silver as well. And perhaps the clearest, starkest, ugliest example of what I'm talking about is Treaty 11. Canada responds to all kinds of petitions from the Southern Territories with a refusal to make treaty for, well, by that time, almost 40 years. And then in 1920, oil is discovered at Norman Wells in the Territories. And in 1921, Canada makes a treaty with the Northern First Nations for that region, basically. So the second phase of the numbered treaties, as they're called, the Northern numbered treaties, occurs only when and because Southerners acting through the government of Canada develop an interest in peaceful access to resources in lands that First Nations of the North control still. And that is the only reason that it happens. Just in passing, let me remark that this is a Treaty 9 government party approaching a post to negotiate one of the phases of Treaty 9 in Northern Ontario. What they are doing is they are reenacting the old fur trade protocol, because this is how parties would have approached a trade post in the old days. They would have stopped a little ways away from the post, put on their finest, painted their faces, and approached as a phalanx with the leader in the center. The government party is replicating that old fur trade protocol. Just like 1877, though, after 1921, with one exception, or actually 2 exceptions known as the Williams Treaties in Ontario, 1923, Canada stops making treaties. And then ensues a 50-year hiatus. No treaties are made. This is the period when, just like after 1877, Canada has all the territory it thinks its entrepreneurs can handle. It's not interested in more treaties. Things begin slowly to change after the Second World War, because again, there's another huge resource boom kicked off, and now it's not just base metals and wood and fish, it's energy, it's oil, it's gas, it's uranium, things like that. They become extremely important, hydroelectric power. So it looks like we're about in the 1970s, as this thing is really coming to a climax, to get a replay of what we've seen before, but things are different this time. Different in 2 ways. First of all, Canadian jurisprudence has evolved. The Supreme Court in 1973 brings down a decision known as the Calder decision, which finds that Aboriginal title exists in law. It's a real thing in law. And that's extremely important. How important it is shown very clearly between 1972 and 1974 by the James Bay Cree, because in 1970 the provincial government of Quebec under Robert Bourassa has announced the project of the century. They're going to create 100,000 jobs. And how are they going to do that? By drowning some of the northern James Bay watershed. basically, to create the head ponds for the Hydro-Quebec project, for the James Bay project. So far, it's just business as usual, standard operating procedure. Canadian province have been doing this for the better part of a century, by 1970s. What's different this time is the James Bay Cree say, oh no, you're not. You're not going to do that. And the James Bay Cree, led particularly by a very bright young leader named Billy Diamond, go down to Montreal and they hire themselves a really good, irascible Irish-Canadian lawyer named James O'Reilly. And they go to court and they get a temporary injunction to stop the James Bay project. Well, that occurs in 72, the Calder decision's in 73, and Crown Corporation, hydro companies, and governments begin to say, whoa, things have changed. Maybe we should take another look at this question. The interim injunction on James Bay was in fact overturned with indecent haste under suspicious circumstances fairly soon thereafter. But the lesson had been delivered. Maybe you should be a little more careful about how you go about using and spoiling Aboriginal lands in the north, because maybe the courts won't tolerate it anymore. And so what happens is the James Bay project is folded into a negotiation with the James Bay Cree and the Inuit of northern Quebec, which is known as the James Bay and Northern Quebec Agreement of 1975. Those two things, Calder and James Bay, together usher in the final phase of treaty making, another phase of territorial treaty. In 1974, the Government of Canada responds to the Calder decision of 73 and the challenge of the James Bay Cree, and it creates the Office of Native Claims. And the Office of Native Claims deals with several kinds of claims, but the one that matters to this story is what's called comprehensive claims. Comprehensive claims are claims by First Nations or Inuit communities that they have land by Aboriginal title, that their lands have not been affected by treaty or conquest. As a matter of fact, no First Nation in Canada has ever conquered militarily by Europeans, so they can forget the second category. So comprehensive claims are Aboriginal title claims. And comprehensive claims settlements, when they're negotiated, are modern treaties. And indeed, that's how they are treated. And in the 1982 Constitution, they are explicitly referred to as protected, just like any other treaty, basically. So now we're into the final phase then, the making of comprehensive treaties. And just to round out the story, in British Columbia, after another important court decision in 1990, the Sparrow decision, British Columbia, which has denied the existence of Aboriginal title for 120 years, suddenly gets religion on Aboriginal title and agrees to negotiate with First Nations there. BC was always the anomaly. BC was always the Australia of North America. BC was the place where territorial treaties, with 14 tiny exceptions, did not occur. And now they're being told, Aboriginal title exists, you better deal with it. So British Columbia enters into a unique process in our history called the British Columbia Treaty Commission process, which is an ongoing process. And basically, we now have 2 completed treaties under the BCTC process. There are 6 more awaiting ratification, and there's about 60 other First Nations in British Columbia at various stages of the BCTC process. And that is the final example, then, of the territorial treaty making. Comprehensive claims, separately negotiated treaties, basically. So if we look back from the vantage point of 2011, what we see is that 4 centuries of treaty making that has gone through a succession of phases, different kinds of treaties. It began with commercial compacts in the fur trade, made and renewed through Aboriginal Protocol. Treaties of peace and friendship, notably here in the Maritimes, for our good examples. And both those commercial compacts and treaties of peace and friendship are particularly endemic to and typical of maritime treaty making, because there aren't territorial treaties in the Maritimes, right? And then after 1763, the third phase, Treaties for territory. Treaties dealing with access to First Nations territory based more or less, usually fairly closely, on the Royal Proclamation mechanics. Only to the Crown at a public meeting called for the purpose. Right? And then after a hiatus, when Canada took a very negative attitude towards First Nations after the First World War, this is the era when the Deputy Minister of Indian Affairs was notorious for saying, quote, "I want to get rid of the Indian problem," basically. That was the attitude. No cooperation at all for about 50 years, until it was forced on government by the Supreme Court of Canada and the James Bay Cree, and you get the making of modern treaties, James Bay and Northern Quebec Agreement, which was a comprehensive claims settlement. Nunavut, 1999, is a comprehensive claims settlement. Technically, so is Nisga'a, though it's separately negotiated. So comprehensive claims settlements and the BCTC process. To my mind, it's a long, complex, but extraordinarily rich and interesting treaty story, stretching over the 4 centuries. And it all started here. It had maritime beginnings at the Habitation, up in the mines near at Port Royal, and in other parts of the Atlantic region. Thank you very much.